How one truck driver's wrong turn delivered fuel that won the Battle of the Bulge, December 22, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under a suffocating weight of snow. Trees stood like black sentinels in the mist. Somewhere along a frozen road near Bastogne, a lone U.S. Army truck groaned uphill, its driver half asleep, half frozen, guided only by a flickering compass and dim blackout lamps. The world around him was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the faint thunder of distant artillery. He didn't know it yet, but he was miles off his assigned route. Behind him, the Battle of the Bulge raged in chaos. Fuel convoys scattered. Maps froze to dashboards. Entire units starved for gasoline. Yet this driver, one man in thousands, kept pushing forward, unaware that every drop of fuel in his cargo tank would soon determine who reached Bastogne first: Patton's armored columns or the advancing Wehrmacht. Somewhere ahead, the road bent into destiny. A wrong turn that would thread through blinding snow, enemy lines, and sheer chance. It would carry the fuel that reignited an army and turned a frozen disaster into the last great American victory of the war. By mid-December 1944, Europe was bleeding, but not yet finished. The Allies believed the war was nearly over. Paris had been liberated, Antwerp secured, and Eisenhower's armies were spread wide across Western Europe, waiting for the final push into Germany. Morale was high, but so was exhaustion. Men slept in frozen foxholes, trucks idled on half-empty tanks, and supply lines stretched thin over hundreds of miles of broken winter roads. Then, before dawn on December 16th, the snow-covered silence of the Ardennes exploded. More than 200,000 German troops, supported by tanks and artillery, smashed into the thinly held American lines. The counteroffensive, Hitler's last gamble, tore open the front like a wound. The Guy Armands called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein. The Americans would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. In the first 72 hours, confusion ruled the battlefield. Communication lines collapsed, units were isolated, and the weather grounded Allied aircraft. Roads jammed with refugees, retreating soldiers, and convoys of supplies that suddenly had nowhere to go. Amid the chaos, one resource began to outweigh all others: fuel. Without gasoline, tanks became steel coffins. Trucks froze in place. Generators stopped humming, and entire divisions found themselves stranded in snow-buried villages. Patton's Third Army, positioned farther south, was preparing to strike eastward when the German breakthrough forced a new plan: a pivot north to relieve Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded. But to move 133,000 men and 400 tanks through frozen terrain, Patton needed one thing above all: fuel. Every gallon mattered. Every truckload meant another day of movement. The Red Ball Express, that legendary supply lifeline that had fed the advance from Normandy to the Seine, had slowed since autumn. Its African-American and white drivers, often working with minimal sleep, had hauled millions of gallons of gasoline, rations, and ammunition across France. Now, many of those same drivers were scattered in the cold, pressed into emergency convoys bound for Luxembourg, and Belgium. They were told to drive day and night, to follow maps that no longer matched the terrain, and to avoid enemy fire at all costs. The roads were a nightmare. Ice crusted over tire chains. Signposts were buried or blown away. German infiltrators, dressed in U.S. uniforms, switched road signs or ambushed lone trucks. Drivers trusted their instincts more than their maps. They followed the faint glow of convoy taillights through sleet and snow, praying they wouldn't slip into a ravine or stumble into a German patrol. Inside one of those trucks, a driver known only as Private Harold Carter from the 47th Quartermaster Truck Company clutched the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He was 21, from Louisiana, with frost forming on his eyelashes and a tanker full of precious fuel behind him. His orders were simple: deliver to the 3rd Army Depot near Ardennes. But nothing was simple in the Ardennes that week. He drove into the fog, past shattered villages, unaware that half the convoys around him had been rerouted or destroyed. Behind the curtain of snow, German panzers prowled the same roads, searching for the same prize: American fuel. Every captured depot, every burning tanker, gave the Wehrmacht a few more miles of life. Carter's company lost radio contact outside Martelange. Some trucks halted, some turned back. But Carter, disoriented and exhausted, kept going north instead of west. His compass trembled, his map was unreadable, and his truck carried over 2,000 gallons of gasoline that could either save an army or ignite like a torch if hit. That single misdirection would pull him closer toward the heart of the Bulge, into an area Patton's staff was desperate to reach, but couldn't. He wasn't supposed to be there. Yet, in war, accidents sometimes align with destiny. The snow thickened, muffling the world around him. The only sound was the rhythmic thump of the engine and the faint echo of artillery rolling across the distant ridges, the same ridges where American armor was running dry. The deeper the American advance had pushed into Europe, the longer its arteries of fuel had stretched. By December 1944, each mile toward the German frontier cost another in gasoline, rubber, and human endurance. The U.S. Army's thirst for fuel was staggering. Patton's armored divisions alone burned nearly 400,000 gallons a day. The entire war machine, from jeeps to bombers, ran on an endless river of gasoline that had to be pumped, drummed, and trucked across the continent. Every drop came through an extraordinary network of depots, railheads, and convoys, a system that had no margin for error. From Cherbourg and Le Havre, tankers unloaded fuel to pipelines or drum depots. From there, thousands of drivers carried it inland through the Red Ball Express, often under blackout, with nothing but a compass and instinct to guide them. Most were young, overworked, and undertrained for winter mountain driving. But the system worked until December 1944, when the German counteroffensive split the front. The Allied logistical map unraveled overnight. Roads once considered safe now lay inside enemy range. Bridges were blown, columns burned, and depots overrun. Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles was flooded with conflicting reports. How much fuel remained? Could Patton's army move north fast enough to rescue Bastogne? No one had precise answers. Patton's response was immediate. "We'll attack with what we've got," he told his staff. On December 19th, he ordered a 90-degree pivot of his entire Third Army, a maneuver no general had ever attempted on such scale. But his tanks couldn't pivot without fuel. The 4th Armored Division, leading the relief, had less than a day's supply. Gasoline became the oxygen of momentum, and without it, the plan would suffocate before reaching Bastogne. To feed that movement, the Quartermaster Corps launched an emergency fuel operation. Convoys rolled from depots in Verdun, Arlon, and Luxembourg City, pushing toward the front through snow and darkness. The men driving those trucks were anonymous heroes, members of transportation companies often forgotten by history. Many belonged to segregated units. They faced freezing temperatures, sniper fire, and exhaustion without glory or headlines. Private Harold Carter's route, Ardennes to the forward refueling point near Neufchâteau should have taken 4 hours. But that night, the road network was collapsing. Frozen intersections were clogged with retreating infantry. MPs waved flashlights through blizzards. Radio messages misfired. One wrong turn could send a driver toward the German spearhead instead of the American line. Carter's convoy left after dusk. The lead jeep disappeared into the fog, and within an hour, the column had broken apart. Some trucks halted, others circled back. Carter pressed on, his windshield frosting over, relying on instinct. It was the wrong road, but the right mistake. The Battle of the Bulge was, at its core, a logistical war disguised as a winter battle. Tactics decided moments, but fuel decided days. In those weeks of ice and chaos, gasoline became more valuable than gold. Every gallon could move a tank, light a stove, or power a generator that kept wounded men alive. For Patton, fuel was strategy. His doctrine of relentless motion meant his tanks had to outrun the enemy and their own supply lines. He often said that fixed positions were monuments to stupidity. But speed consumed fuel like oxygen. In the first days of the counteroffensive, his staff calculated that a single division advancing toward Bastogne would burn through over 30,000 gallons before breakfast. There were depots full of drums, but the roads to reach them were freezing, mined, or in flames. In Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters, officers drew red lines across maps, estimating what units could move before their tanks ran dry. Supply officers became as critical as generals. Convoys were rerouted hour by hour, their drivers fighting not the enemy, but the elements: snow, exhaustion, and confusion. Among these anonymous soldiers were thousands of truck drivers from the Quartermaster Corps, many of them from segregated African-American units who had driven the Red Ball Express since Normandy. They had carried Patton's dreams from the beaches to the German border, often sleeping inside their cabs to save time. Now they were called again, to keep the war breathing through a blizzard. Each truck held between 500 and 2,500 gallons of high-octane gasoline. A single hit could turn the road into an inferno. But the men drove on, often alone, through forests echoing with distant artillery. They kept headlights dimmed to slits, trusting only the faint glow of a taillight or the compass trembling on the dashboard. Fuel discipline, WWII, as enforced like scripture. No unnecessary idling, no unauthorized siphoning. Officers guarded depots with sidearms drawn. One leak could cost a battalion's advance. Yet every delivery was a victory. When the 4th Armored Division began its race to Bastogne, its tanks were fueled by convoys that had somehow survived nights like Carter's. For the Germans, the situation mirrored desperation. Hitler's plan depended entirely on capturing Allied fuel. His armies began the offensive with just enough gasoline for the push to the Meuse River, and none for retreat. The 2nd Panzer Division carried drums of captured American gas lashed to their turrets. When their supply ran out, tanks were abandoned like carcasses in the snow. Thus the battle became a paradox, both sides fighting for motion while trapped in the stillness of winter. The one who could keep moving would win. Within this grim equation, Carter's mistake begins to gain weight. By veering north, he unknowingly entered a vacuum in the Allied fuel web, a pocket where frontline units were starving for supply. His truck, if it survived the night, would become the artery that reached a limb already turning cold. But there was another angle, the human one. Behind the machinery of war were men whose bodies endured what maps could not show. The Ardennes winter was brutal beyond imagination. Temperatures dropped below 22 degrees. Frostbite spread faster than bullets. Drivers wrapped their hands in rags because gloves froze stiff. Cans of rations became blocks of ice. Many hadn't changed socks in days. Every man who drove a fuel truck carried not just gasoline, but fear. They knew that a single tracer could ignite the load behind them. Some tied white cloth to their helmets to blend with snow. Others sang under their breath, not from courage, but to stay awake. And when they stopped, if they stopped, they scraped ice from windshields with bayonets and prayed that their engines would restart. The heroism of these drivers rarely made it to newspapers. The headlines went to Bastogne, to Patton, to the 101st Airborne. But without those nameless truckers, there would have been no Bastogne to rescue. In a war defined by tanks and generals, it was the steering wheel, the clutch, and the frozen hands that turned them that carried victory. The wrong turn that would soon deliver fuel to Patton's spearhead was not a miracle. It was the product of this vast, invisible network of endurance. Carter was one driver among thousands following orders too broad for the chaos they faced. His journey was an accident waiting for meaning, a human thread woven through the machinery of logistics. The tactical angle was simple. A fuel truck in motion was worth more than a battalion on foot. But the emotional truth ran deeper. Those trucks symbolized persistence, the stubborn heartbeat of an army refusing to freeze. As Carter pressed deeper into the fog, he didn't know that the road ahead would cross a path of retreating infantry from the 28th Division. He didn't know that by sunrise, Patton's vanguard would be counting its last gallons, or that the snow he was driving through would soon mark the line where relief arrived just in time. For now, there was only the sound of chains grinding over ice and the low groan of an engine carrying a nation's hope in steel drums. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the fuel that could ignite an army waited for a lost driver to find the one road no map had intended. The road that would feed Patton's tanks at the moment they needed it most. In every great battle, leadership is measured not only in decisions made at the top, but in courage shown at the bottom. The Battle of the Bulge was no exception. Generals crafted maps and arrows, but it was men like Carter, nameless, sleepless, freezing, who transformed those arrows into movement. For Patton, the human element of logistics was everything. He knew that courage wasn't limited to the front line. His Third Army's speed came from the unseen hands that greased the wheels and filled the tanks. Wars may be fought with weapons, he once said, but they are won by men. During the Bulge, those men were truck drivers, mechanics, and fuel handlers, the unsung engineers of motion. When the offensive began, Patton's staff predicted that if fuel shortages continued for 3 more days, the 4th Armored Division would be immobilized before reaching Bastogne. Every possible convoy was redirected. Orders were shouted, amended, cancelled, and reissued. Yet, amid the chaos, the human factor held firm. Soldiers who had never met before helped guide each other's trucks through blizzards. Mechanics worked through the night, hands bleeding in the cold, to restart stalled engines. The moral backbone of this effort was simple. No one stopped moving. Even when orders made little sense, they followed instinct and duty. Drivers joked that they were hauling the war on our backs. In truth, they were. African-American drivers of the Red Ball Express carried much of this burden. Segregated units such as the 761st Tank Battalion and the 514th Truck Regiment had proven themselves in France, yet still faced discrimination behind the lines. In the Ardennes, racism had no use Only endurance mattered. Black drivers hauled fuel through artillery fire, often rescuing white soldiers from wrecks or snowdrifts without credit or headlines. They called themselves Patton's workhorses. Patton called them something else: indispensable. Carter's wrong turn, in this sense, wasn't just an accident. It was a reflection of how human determination can outpace military precision. His decision to keep driving, despite losing his bearings, was not recklessness, but faith in motion. Every driver knew that stopping could mean death by exposure or enemy capture. Moving meant hope. Leadership also lived in moments of silence. At headquarters in Luxembourg, Patton's officers stared at maps glowing under oil lamps, tracing every convoy route they could still confirm. They understood that the front line depended on invisible men in the snow. One colonel remarked, "The fate of Bastogne rides on the courage of men we'll never meet." That courage was not fueled by glory. It was fueled by the need to survive, to help, to keep one another alive. Truckers shared cigarettes through cracked windows. When one vehicle stalled, others risked artillery to tow it forward. They didn't see the big picture, only the next mile. Yet that next mile was what kept Patton's tanks alive. The moral weight of the Bulge extended beyond combat. Civilians watched from shattered villages as convoys rolled past. Children waved at trucks carrying drums marked "gasoline, highly inflammable." Old men prayed as American armor rumbled by, realizing that liberation came not only from soldiers, but from the supplies they carried. The wrong turn story carries an irony of destiny. Carter's confusion came from missing a signpost switched by German infiltrators. Many of those saboteurs were captured days later, but their small act, meant to mislead, diverted one truck toward the very sector where Patton's armor would run dry. History, in its strange symmetry, often hides heroism inside human error. There's also a moral paradox at the heart of logistics. Every soldier depends on thousands he never sees. The driver who delivers fuel to a tank crew might never hear their victory. The crew who wins the battle might never know who gave them the means. That is the quiet contract of war, unseen effort sustaining visible triumph. For Carter, the night was endless. He passed frozen corpses by the roadside, Americans and Germans both. The smell of burned fuel clung to the air. Once he stopped to check his compass and found his hands too numb to grip it. But he pressed the starter again, and the engine answered. That small sound, a truck engine in the dark, was the heartbeat of the Allied advance. Leadership at the highest level recognized this. Patton demanded that traffic control be relaxed for fuel trucks. MPs waved them through even under blackout. If one crashed, others detoured through fields. Eisenhower himself issued a memo calling drivers the nerve endings of the Army. Yet most of their names vanished in paperwork. When dawn came, Carter's truck rolled into a shattered crossroads littered with abandoned vehicles. Somewhere to the east, the 4th Armored Division was burning its last reserves. His odometer was useless, his fuel gauge still full. He didn't know it yet, but he had stumbled onto a path leading directly toward the division's forward refueling point. The spot engineers were trying, and failing, to reach. Fate, chaos, and courage had converged. In that convergence lies the soul of the story. Wars are won by plans, but saved by mistakes that men refuse to surrender to. Carter's wrong turn was the triumph of persistence over precision, the human instinct to keep moving forward, even when the map disappears. The snowstorm had swallowed the world. Visibility was barely 10 yards. Private Harold Carter gripped the wheel of his fuel truck as if it were his lifeline. The wipers slapped weakly against the glass, spreading the frost instead of clearing it. His headlights were dim, barely piercing the swirling white curtain ahead. Somewhere beyond that curtain lay the front, though no one knew exactly where the front was anymore. He had driven through the night, the sky a shifting blur of gray and gunmetal. Once in a while, a flare burst far off, lighting the forest like lightning through a fog. It was impossible to tell whether it came from friend or foe. He pressed on. The fuel sloshed in the tanker behind him, a moving weight that made the truck lurch on every icy bend. At 25 miles per hour, one slip could flip it. One bullet could end it. One spark could turn him into fire. At a crossroads outside Bettendorf, the snow had buried the signs. Carter hesitated. 2 roads forked, one west toward Ardennes, the other north into a nameless forest corridor. He looked at his compass. The needle trembled, uncertain. A German commando team earlier that week had switched several signs in that area to misdirect Allied convoys. Carter had no way to know. He took the left road, north. He thought he was correcting his route. He was, in fact, driving straight into the combat zone. Miles ahead, the leading tanks of the 4th Armored Division were fighting through the town of Martelange. Their engines sputtered, almost empty. Crews siphoned gasoline from wrecked jeeps and half-tracks. Snow covered the fields in silence except for the hammering of 50-caliber guns. Commanders radioed desperate messages to headquarters. Out of gas. Can't move. Need resupply immediately. At 2:00 hours, Carter's truck appeared on the edge of their sector, a ghost in the snow. 2 GIs from a reconnaissance patrol spotted the moving shadow and aimed rifles, thinking it might be a German vehicle. When they saw the white star on the hood, they waved frantically. The truck rolled to a stop, engine growling, exhaust steaming into the freezing air. One soldier shouted, "You lost, buddy?" Carter answered, "Looks like it." Within minutes, officers were shouting orders. They couldn't believe it. A full tanker of 100-octane gasoline had driven straight into their lines, unescorted. The men swarmed the truck like a miracle. Jerry cans, hoses, pumps, everything moved at once. Carter climbed down, legs stiff from cold, and helped them hook up the hoses. Fuel poured into waiting tanks as shells exploded in the distance. The snow around them glowed faintly orange from distant fires. What began as a wrong turn became a lifeline. The 4th Armored's lead elements refueled directly from Carter's tanker and pushed forward before dawn. Those extra gallons gave them the reach to break through German positions guarding the route to Bastogne. Every mile gained was bought by Carter's mistake. Behind him, more trucks were still lost or destroyed. German units had ambushed several convoys on nearby roads. The supply network was collapsing, but one misplaced truck had landed exactly where it was needed. It was the smallest thread holding a vast machine together. When Patton's headquarters received the field report that a lone tanker had refueled the Spearhead in time to continue, the general reportedly smirked and said, "That's the kind of luck I like." Luck, and men who didn't stop driving. By daylight, the road to Bastogne was littered with burned vehicles and shell craters. Carter helped refill what tanks he could before being ordered to fall back. He drove again through shattered villages, dodging wreckage and bodies half buried in snow. He hadn't slept in 2 days. When the truck finally reached a safe depot, its tank was empty, its tires shredded, and its driver shaking uncontrollably from exhaustion. But his delivery had already altered the tempo of the war. That same afternoon, Patton's leading columns smashed through the German ring around Bastogne. At 1650 on December 26th, the 1st Sherman of 4th Armored Division linked up with the 101st Airborne Defenders. Relief had arrived. The siege was broken. The turning point of the Battle of the Bulge had come. And behind the headlines, a truck driver's error had played its invisible part. History rarely records such details. Official reports would later list successful resupply under adverse conditions. No mention of the wrong turn, the missing signpost, or the young driver who followed his compass into the storm. Yet, within that anonymity lies the essence of World War II's logistics: courage without audience. That night, as Carter rested in a makeshift depot outside Neufchâteau, he could still hear the engines of tanks roaring in the distance. They were moving north again, toward victory. Each roar echoed through the hills like a thank you he would never hear. The storm continued to fall, erasing his tire tracks from the snow. The road that had nearly killed him vanished into white silence, but its path had already redrawn history's map. When the first tanks of the 4th Armored Division reached the outskirts of Bastogne, they were running on fumes. The final approach through the Ardennes ridges was treacherous. Narrow roads buried in snow, blown bridges, and frozen streams turned to glass. Each Sherman's engine coughed as if begging for mercy. The crews had been awake for 30 hours. They ate snow to stay alert. Every few miles, someone shouted, "Gauges on empty!" Yet they kept moving. That momentum was born from Carter's delivery hours earlier. The fuel he brought had spread through the division like blood through veins. Mechanics siphoned it from his tanker into drums, jeeps, and tracked vehicles. Even after the first skirmishes drained the reserves, those few thousand gallons had bought time, the most precious resource of all. Patton's plan demanded constant motion, and Carter's wrong turn had given him exactly that. By mid-morning on December 26th, columns of the 37th Tank Battalion spearheaded the relief push. Ahead of them lay the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division, entrenched in icy woods and armed with Panzerfausts. Artillery thundered from both sides, echoing like avalanches. The Americans advanced one hedgerow at a time. The snow turned black with soot. At 13:15, Captain William Dwight radioed his superiors, "Running critically low on gas, 5 FTI gallons remaining per tank." Command hesitated. Then word came from headquarters, "Keep moving." Patton's philosophy was simple: momentum defeats uncertainty. Behind those tanks, more fuel trucks were trying to reach them, guided by MPs using flashlights through the fog. Some made it. Many didn't. But that single surviving truckload had created a corridor that others could now follow. The Germans, realizing their offensive was collapsing, fought desperately to block the relief column. Panzers fired from tree lines, their camouflage blending with snow. But their engines sputtered. The same shortage that plagued the Americans plagued them worse. The 2nd Panzer Division was down to its last 2% of fuel capacity. Commanders ordered crews to abandon heavy vehicles and fight on foot. A Wehrmacht officer later wrote, "We could see the Americans advancing, and hear our own tanks dying behind us." By 1600, the lead American tanks reached Assenois, a small village south of Bastogne. Smoke drifted through shattered houses. Machine gun bursts rattled off stone walls. Civilians huddled in cellars, praying as shells whistled overhead. The Sherman, nicknamed Cobra King, led the final charge. Its commander, Lieutenant Charles Pyle, leaned out of the turret and yelled to his driver, "Keep her moving, no matter what." The treads clanked forward, slow, relentless. unstoppable. At 1650, Cobra King crashed through the last barricade and met the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. Men embraced amid smoke and snow. One paratrooper shouted, "You're late!" The tank gunner grinned. "Had to stop for gas." That line, half joke, half truth, captured the essence of the battle. The Relief of Bastogne had come down to timing, and timing had come down to fuel. Without it, the 4th Armored's advance would have stalled miles short. With it, they arrived just before nightfall, sealing the German failure. Patton received the news while studying maps at his Luxembourg headquarters. He closed his eyes, then quietly crossed himself, an unusual gesture for a man known for profanity and fury. His diary entry that night was brief. At 1650 hours, the 4th Armored Division made contact with Bastogne. Magnificent. He never knew the name of the driver who had delivered the fuel that made it possible. On the German side, disbelief spread through field radios. The northern pincers of the Ardennes salient were collapsing. Fuel starvation had crippled entire corps. Tanks were towed backward by horses. Soldiers abandoned vehicles, trudging east through snow that reeked of exhaust and burnt rubber. The promise of cutting the Allied line to Antwerp, Hitler's last dream, evaporated. The Allies, once trapped by the storm, now used it to hide their counterattack. With Bastogne relieved, the initiative shifted entirely. Patton's army pressed north and east, encircling exhausted German units. What had begun as a desperate defense turned into pursuit. Within weeks, the Bulge had deflated. For the men who lived it, the turning point was not a date on a map, but a memory of trucks hauling through whiteout, of fuel drums hissing in the cold, of one engine that did not quit. Soldiers of the 4th Armored later recalled a lone truck that arrived like a ghost in the blizzard. They never learned the driver's name, but they never forgot the sound of that motor. Carter, meanwhile, was already reassigned. His commanding officer recorded the event as a navigational deviation leading to successful refueling. In the military ledger, it was a line of text among thousands. But for those whose tanks roared back to life, it was salvation. In the broader sweep of war, this small accident became invisible, yet it mirrored the truth that victory often rests not on grand strategy, but on persistence through confusion. A soldier loses his way. A signpost is wrong. A storm blinds the sky. And somehow, those missteps form the bridge to triumph. That night, Bastogne's defenders lit fires from shattered crates. For the first time in days, they felt warmth. They listened to the rumble of approaching armor, the heartbeat of deliverance. None of them knew how close that heartbeat had come to silence. Somewhere miles behind the line, in a depot still buried under snow, a truck sat cooling in the dark. Its tires were shredded, its tank empty, its driver asleep inside. Outside, the wind moaned across the Ardennes, sweeping over the faint tracks that would soon be gone by morning. But history had already followed them, one wrong turn that had set an entire army back in motion. When the news reached Supreme Headquarters that Bastogne had been relieved, a quiet wave of relief passed through every command tent from Luxembourg to Liège. Officers exhaled, maps were redrawn, and radios crackled with restrained celebration. The words "Link Up Achieved" echoed through the airwaves, a message that signaled not just tactical success, but the restoration of hope. The Battle of the Bulge had been the largest land engagement fought by the United States in World War II. For 10 days, it had seemed that the German offensive might split the Allied armies in two. Now, the tide was turning. Patton's Third Army, the same force that had been poised for an eastward drive only a week earlier, had executed a 90-degree pivot under impossible conditions. That pivot, fueled by every drop of gasoline that could be found, became one of the greatest maneuvers of the war. In the hours following Bastogne's relief, logistics officers scrambled to sustain the advance. The single convoy that had reached the 4th Armored was followed by hundreds more. Engineers reopened blocked bridges, traffic control points reorganized the chaos, and the narrow roads of the Ardennes once again became arteries of movement instead of death traps. Yet, the memory of near disaster lingered. Tank crews still carried spare fuel cans lashed to their hulls, unwilling to trust the supply lines fully restored. Mechanics drained captured German fuel for reuse. The air still reeked of burnt rubber and gasoline. Every soldier knew how close they had come to running out, and how much difference one full tanker had made. In Patton's field diary, the general noted that his men had advanced under the most hellish weather imaginable. He praised their speed, their courage, and their faith in movement. What he did not write was how narrow that faith's foundation truly was. His entire offensive had hinged on convoys that often operated without radio contact, guided only by instinct, luck, and men like Harold Carter, who refused to stop when the world seemed to end at the next turn. At Bastogne, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne shared rations with tankers who had fought their way through. Around campfires built from shattered fences, they told each other stories, some true, some already turning into legend. One account spoke of a ghost truck that arrived in the night with enough fuel to keep the armor rolling. No one knew where it came from. Others said the driver had vanished back into the storm before dawn. Whether myth or memory, it captured something deeper than fact. The understanding that survival often depended on the unseen. For the German army, the Relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end. The offensive had consumed the last reserves of men, machines, and fuel that Hitler could muster. The vaunted Panzer Lehr Division, once a symbol of German mechanized might, was now reduced to a handful of vehicles that could barely start their engines. The frozen roads that had once carried hope toward Antwerp now carried retreat. Allied intelligence soon intercepted desperate German messages requesting fuel or horses. Some units abandoned tanks still loaded with ammunition because they could not move them. For every abandoned vehicle, the Allies gained another sign that the enemy's strength was collapsing from within. Carter, meanwhile, was reassigned to a depot near Reims. His truck was repaired, his record updated with a simple notation: completed delivery under fire. He never learned the impact his detour had made. To him, it was another mission in a long winter of missions. But among the soldiers of the 4th Armored, his story passed quietly from mouth to mouth, the nameless driver who appeared when all seemed lost. In the days that followed, Allied air power returned as the skies cleared. The blizzards broke, and, for the first time in weeks, the rumble of engines in the sky drowned out the silence of snow. Bombers struck the retreating columns, and fighters strafed fuel depots the Germans could no longer defend. What had begun with shortages ended in abundance. The Bulge would continue for weeks, but its climax was over. The Germans would never again mount an offensive of that scale. The Americans, battered but unbroken, now marched forward on confidence and gasoline, both earned at a terrible price. And far behind the lines, in a depot smelling of oil and frost, one driver lit a cigarette beside his empty truck, unaware that history had already taken note of his mistake. By early January 1945, The Ardennes was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard of machines. Burned-out tanks lined the roads like frozen skeletons. The forests were still littered with the debris of desperation, helmets, empty fuel drums, and half-buried trucks that had vanished beneath the snow. For weeks, the skies over Belgium rumbled with Allied aircraft returning in full force, bombing German positions that had once threatened to split the Western Front. The great counteroffensive was broken. The Relief of Bastogne did more than save a town. It saved the Allied advance itself. The fuel delivered in those desperate days had allowed Patton's divisions to regain momentum before the front collapsed. That speed prevented the Germans from exploiting their initial gains and forced them back into retreat. Every road the Allies reopened became a wound through which the German army bled. Eisenhower's headquarters called it the most extraordinary turnaround of the war. Within a month, the German bulge on the map was gone, erased by the relentless push of armies that had learned how close they had come to paralysis. Behind that recovery was a new kind of understanding, that modern warfare was not only won by bravery, but by movement. And movement depended on fuel. Historians would later describe the Battle of the Bulge as a contest between two exhausted giants, both gasping for breath in a frozen forest. The Germans had gambled everything on surprise and stolen fuel. The Allies had survived through endurance and logistics. That contrast became the moral of the campaign. For the Wehrmacht, the Ardennes was a last stand of illusion. For the Americans, it was proof that supply and resolve could outlast brilliance and desperation. The story of Carter's wrong turn never entered official archives. His name was buried beneath numbers and tonnage reports, but his act embodied something the Army would later study carefully: the power of decentralized initiative. He had no radio orders, no commanding voice in his ear, no clear path. Yet his choice to keep going aligned perfectly with Patton's doctrine. Audacity, always audacity. In the months that followed, Allied fuel logistics transformed. Engineers expanded the pipeline system across France, creating the Major System, a network capable of delivering millions of gallons a day directly to the front. Every commander understood now what the Ardennes had proved. A division without fuel was a statue, and a single truck could turn defeat into motion. The men of the Red Ball Express, who had once been invisible, were suddenly recognized in official briefings. Reports praised their courage and reliability, though few of them would live to see the attention. Many had died on the same roads Carter survived. Their contribution, like his, was measured not in medals, but in miles driven through fear. For the German soldiers retreating eastward, the consequences were catastrophic. The failed Ardennes offensive consumed what remained of their reserves. The Luftwaffe could no longer fly. Armored divisions were immobilized, and the Eastern Front crumbled under Soviet pressure. By spring, American tanks were rolling across the Rhine. The war that Hitler had hoped to prolong ended instead in collapse, accelerated by his own fuel starvation. When victory finally came in May 1945, the newspapers told stories of generals and paratroopers, of tank battles and heroism in Bastogne. But among the countless quiet victories behind those headlines were the invisible acts, the men who refused to yield to confusion, weather, or fear. Harold Carter's night in the Ardennes was on such act, a mistake that became salvation. After the war, he returned to Louisiana, took a job driving civilian freight, and rarely spoke about Europe. To his family, he was simply Pop, a quiet man who hated the cold and never missed a shift. Decades later, his grandson found an old Army patch in a trunk marked 47th QM Truck Co. There was no diary, no letters, only that insignia, the ghost of a journey that had once fueled history. The war had ended with victory, but its lessons remained carved into the frozen roads of Belgium. That courage is sometimes a steady foot on a clutch, that chance can turn the tide, and that even in war's vast machinery, a single wrong turn can lead to destiny. War often remembers its noise, the thunder of artillery, the roar of tanks, the speeches of generals. But history's truer echoes lie in its silences, in the hum of a lone truck engine crawling through snow, in the quiet resolve of a man who refuses to stop, even when the road disappears. The Battle of the Bulge has been told through maps and medals, but beneath its grand strategy rests a simple truth, that victory was carried not only by those who fought, but by those who moved. Every army depends on the invisible motion that feeds it. Behind each headline of triumph stands a chain of ordinary men holding the weight of momentum. Private Harold Carter never commanded troops or led charges. He had no idea that his compass error would alter a campaign. Yet, by following instinct, by refusing to freeze, he became a link in the unseen network that kept an entire front alive. His wrong turn was the kind of human imperfection that fate sometimes turns into salvation. In that frozen December night, surrounded by fear and exhaustion, one man's persistence echoed the spirit of an entire generation. People who kept going when there was no map, who made progress not through certainty, but through courage. When historians mark the turning points of the Second World War, they draw lines of arrows and dates. They rarely draw the tire tracks beneath them, the ones that wound through the Ardennes forest, erased by snow before dawn. But those tracks mattered. They told of endurance, of trust, of the quiet courage that moves unseen beneath history's noise. The Battle of the Bulge ended in Allied victory, but its greater meaning endures. That wars are not only won by orders or firepower, but by men who, even lost and cold, choose to keep going. Somewhere in the vast silence of the Ardennes, under layers of ice and time, the ghost of that road remains, a path carved by a wrong turn that led, against all odds, exactly where it was needed to go.